Hello, everyone, and welcome. I think Dan was just doing something off screen as we
Sorry.
started. It's all good.
Apologies.
So this is the second part of a couple of kind of interviews that I've done on the problem of evil with Dan Speaks. So if you either watch this one and then if you enjoy it, go back and watch the other one, or if you feel like you want to go and watch the other one first, feel free to. And we're going to kind of take off where we sort of left the last conversation. So the last conversation, we talked about logical problems, logical arguments from evil, Mackey's argument in particular, and some kind of responses to those. And now we're going to talk about evidential problems from evil today. So I thought the first thing that it would be useful to sort of clarify is the difference between abductive and deductive arguments. So like, what's the how is it? What's a deductive argument supposed to do? What's an abductive argument supposed to do? And how does that inform our discussion today?
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, these things, they have a sort of, there's a shared obviousness to these at a certain level that I'm going to note. And then, but also, as with all philosophy, Nathan, there are controversies even about these things, right? And high level philosophy can be done on whether or not the things I'm about to say are exactly right. But I think this will be good enough for our purposes, right? So what we typically mean by a deductive argument is an argument that purports just on the force of the truth of the premises to, as it were, guarantee the conclusion. So a deductive argument is one which, if you accept the truth of the conclusions, just in virtue of its logical form, you're rationally required to accept the truth of the conclusion. To say, I accept these premises, but I reject the conclusion, would be to be involved in a kind of pretty fundamental form of irrationality. So one, just for just for ease, in a deductive argument, the premises are supposed to force the conclusion, the truth of the conclusion. Abductive reasoning is supposed to be what we sometimes call inference to the best explanation, or sometimes these all just get lumped together in certain kinds of inductive reasoning, where what we mean in these kinds of arguments is that the truth of the premises in some respect probabilifies the conclusion, or strictly speaking, when we're talking abductively, we mean something like this, that the conclusion of the abductive argument is probably true because it's the right thing to infer from the evidence, right? It's made probable by the premises that you accept. The best explanation for the truth of the premises is that this conclusion is true. And so the big distinction you might want to draw between, say, what we're going to be thinking about, last time we were thinking about logical or sometimes deductive arguments from evil to evidential arguments from evil, is whether the premises that are in these arguments are purporting to force the conclusion or merely raise the probability of the conclusion. And in our case, we're talking about the existence of God. So the deductive arguments are supposed to take us from premises such that if we accept them, then it's false that God exists and that there's a kind of logical connection there. Whereas in the arguments that we're going to consider today, I think the premises of the argument, what they strictly get us to is probably there's no God. How's that?
Yeah, I think that's all right.
Maybe you had something even more subtle in mind by the abductive inductive distinction.
No, not in particular. I think I've heard people talk about abductive sort of involving risky conclusions and things like that. But I've also heard people talk about deductive arguments in the same sense, where they, so in the what's it called, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, they say, if you have credences towards the premises, suppose, and then you multiply those together in the conjunction if they're independent, and then that might not actually compel you to the conclusion. There's still some kind of nuance there, I suppose. But
that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know
if it's worth saying much more on that.
It's funny though that it's funny that, like, you start out with a thing that's supposed to be totally intuitive and distinct, we can all just agree on, and it doesn't take long before there'll be controversies, and maybe we can see how that goes if just paying attention to that as we think about for example, Rowe's argument or other of the supposed evidential arguments for the claim that God doesn't exist? Does it turn out that those bits of nuance matter or not? That's just worth probably having our finger on the pulse of.
Right. And I think in terms of what you've said, that probably suffices for what we need, right? For just looking at Rowe's argument and understanding how it's.
Let's see. I feel like, Nathan, typically when I show up at some sporting thing I have to participate in, they usually let me stretch out and throw a few balls and take a few shots
Right.
first. But like you're right in there, jumping right into the.
So I was thinking then, if we just started off by kind of painting the picture of what is Rowe's evidential argument from evil, so how's it supposed to work, and if it would be useful, and it might not, I can take this down. I've got this from the actual a reprint of the paper in an anthology, if it helps.
Good. Yeah. So this was I'm just looking at the font and the wording here. I think this is the evil and the varieties of atheism paper.
Yeah, it is. I think. It doesn't say on this page.
That's okay. I'm sure it's the. Yeah. So so Rowe's argument has taken on different forms over time in slightly different ways, but here's the heart of it that you can see on the screen, and I'll try to gloss these in ways that might be easier for us to keep track of as we go on. But here was the big idea. The big idea was, remember where we left off last time was there were efforts, especially in Mackey, to show that there was a kind of logical contradiction in the set of things that the theist accepts. And where we left off, again, it's mildly controversial, but my inclination is to conclude that no logical version of the argument from evil is especially compelling, and that I'm still open, right? So I don't mean to say that, Nathan, in a way that doesn't mean that tomorrow you might not show me a new logical version and I'd be like, well, there it is. But what I take away from the Plantinga-Mackey discussion and some of the downstream discussions of that is that logical consistency is kind of cheap. It's a little easy to get it. And so the idea that there's going to be a logical inconsistency in the set of things the theist accepts is going to be really hard to demonstrate. And extremely thoughtful theists are going to find ways to avoid it generally. Again, you might think there's something infelicitous about that, but that's the way that typically goes. Rowe seemed to agree. So William Rowe himself thought, yeah, that's basically right, that something like the logical argument doesn't quite go through. And so he shifted, basically in the 70s, he shifted to an evidential version of the argument that's not nearly as easy to parry in the ways that we were considering last time, partly because it's grounded in more concrete cases. Remember, we were worried that in some respects, Mackey's view just turns on a very general and abstract notion of evil. Well, Rowe, he brings in the blood and guts, right, and gets to a deeper heart of what probably bugs most of us about evil in the world. It's apparent gratuity, right? So what we have here is an initial presentation of his argument. So here are the premises, right? The first premise is there exist instances of intent. So he's going to ground it in instances of intense suffering of a certain kind. So he says, look, there are instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So think of it like this. This has come to be the terminology that if there are gratuitous evils in the world, then they're evils that, so to speak, not even God could have had a good reason to allow, right? There could be no morally justifying reason for God to permit it. And then we're getting here Rowe's specification of that. What's that mean? Well, he thinks if God were going to allow evil, and now notice Rowe is allowing that God might allow, there could be a God and there could be some evils, but what he thinks is that such a being would allow evils only if that evil would contribute to some greater good, or it would lead to the avoidance of some worse evil, right? So if God's going to allow some things, which he might, they got to be like that, right? And so here's another way to gloss that. What Rowe thinks is, if God exists, there would be no gratuitous evils, right? So that's what's going on in premise 2. So look at premise 2. It says an omniscient, holy, good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So the way we might gloss these two premises now is, the first premise is this: there are in fact gratuitous evils, right? There are evils that God could have prevented without losing anything important in the world, right? And then the second premise is this: if God exists, there wouldn't be any evils like that, right? There wouldn't be any gratuitous ones. There'd only be the kind that contributed to a greater good, or you needed them to avoid a worse evil. But if the first premise is true and the second premise is true, then we should conclude, 3, there doesn't exist such a being as that. Strictly speaking, his conclusion, which he tells us slightly later, is a probabilistic one, right? So really, if we get it out explicitly, what 3 is probably there's no such being. And then maybe I can say a little bit more of why he thinks that's probably. How's that for up to this point?
No, that's good. And so it's the idea that the kind of more of these instances that we find or come across, they kind of plug into one in the argument and strengthen the conclusion, as it were.
That's right. In fact, I might put it even more dramatically than that, because the next natural question to ask is, should we be accepting these premises, right? And so if you think about that first premise, that turns out to have been where all of the almost all, I'll say something about whether or not there's action at 2, the second premise too, but almost all of the action since the publication of this piece and its downstream explosion, almost all the action has been at premise 1, right? So here's the question you might ask yourself: why think premise 1 is true? Why think that there really are instances of intense suffering that have this structure? Why think that there really are gratuitous evils? And it's in light of that Rowe gets the, you might say, he makes the issue very concrete. Because the way that Rowe supports the first premise, and here's why we sometimes call this argument the inductive argument, is that he supports this premise by appealing to a couple instances. In the first piece, in that piece, he just used the Fawn case. So the Fawn case is kind of famous. Maybe lots of your viewers know this case, but should I give the case?
It's okay to talk about, because I think in light of some of the things we mentioned as well about talking about the problem of evil in the last video, where we said, we've got to kind of be careful to distinguish between the philosophical case and like actual instances of evil. So this isn't perhaps the type of discussion to have with someone who's actually experiencing evil or thinking, this is purely a kind of academic or intellectual exercise, as it were. So we don't, but we also don't want to. We're talking about how there's this kind of middle ground where you also don't want to rhetorically, in the case of Rowe raising these instances, to say, well, you've just got an emotional problem, Rowe, so your argument is about. And we talked about that in the last episode a little bit, if people are interested. But feel free to raise both.
Yeah, so good. Maybe I should say this from the outset, if this wasn't clear already. I did announce that with respect to the logical problem, my judgment is it seems to me the theist has quite plausible things to say in reply to that. And let me announce here, I think this evidential problem is much harder. This one, in various of its forms, does in fact pinch me as a Christian theist quite sincerely. And I take it very seriously as a serious kind of objection to theism, and it's partly because of this point about the way that Rowe brings it down to the concrete. So the two cases that have become sort of famous that Rowe gives. So think about that first premise. That first premise now, as I'm glossing it, is just there really are gratuitous evils, right? There really are evils that that God could have eliminated if there were a God. He could have eliminated and not lost anything, right? And so now, why does Rowe think that? Here are his two cases. One first case is sometimes called the Fawn case, or sometimes it's called Bambi. And it goes like this. He says, think about a case where a poor fawn is caught in a forest fire. The fire hasn't been started by, assholes or anything like that. It's just a lightning strike has caused the forest fire, and it's surrounded the poor fawn. And he's trying to get, he's terrified, of course, right, but can't get out. And finally, he's engulfed in the flames. And this is going to turns out to be important to the overarching story. He doesn't just die immediately of the wounds. The fawn lays on the floor of the forest in great pain for like 2 days before finally succumbing to the horrors of this trauma and then dying. Right. So that's case one. And Rowe says that's a paradigmatic instance of something we should think is a gratuitous evil, right? His second case, case two, sometimes it's called E2, sometimes called the Sioux case, is about this one's based on an actual news article that in 1986 of a young girl, 5-year-old girl in Flint, Michigan, whose mother left the 5-year-old girl in the care of the mother's boyfriend, went out to do something, and the asshole then raped, tortured, and killed the young girl. Right, and so take those as E1 and E2, and now notice how bloodless it is to call them E1 and E2. But like, look, part of what's doing the work here is that they're not bloodless cases. They're cases where we all see like that really is a terrible thing not abstract evil. No, this is real evil. This is real suffering. And then here's Rowe's move, right? And this is the crucial move that's supposed to, how do you get from those cases in their detail to the claim that they're gratuitous evils? Here's how Rowe does it, at least initially. He says, think about the Fawn case and Sue's case and try to ask yourself whether you can come up with any even minimally plausible good reason that an omnipotent and omnibenevolent being could have for letting things like that happen, for letting those particular things happen. And now maybe here it's good to just stop and say, look, Rowe is very, very smart, and everybody who's got just a little bit of background in the free will problem is already cooking up their theodicies, right? And are you seeing now, as soon as you try to cook them up, why it's like really hard to see how they go? Because
a Dr. Pangloss moment in the
exactly.
Yeah,
that's right. You'll feel like as soon as you start trying, you're going to have to feel Panglossian, right? And why is that? Well, look, he thought about these cases explicitly. If you want to invoke a free will effort here, that's partly why he picks the fawn, right? It's not the idea that free will is involved is just off the table with respect to the fawn, unless you have some, really, you want to work out some view about the importance of fawn free will, but most people have not wanted to do that. So it doesn't look like you're going to get any leverage by the free will theodicy in this. Okay, well, now what about soul making? Well, again, the fact that it was a fawn makes it hard. There's a question about how soul making would go for animals at all. And keep in mind that according to the story, no one ever knows about this, right? No one ever finds out. No one finds the fawn. No one reflects on their own moral concern because of the fawn's death. It just happens out there, and it happens out, as he notes, the case of the fawn just is multiplied a gazillion times throughout natural history, right? So the soul making looks like it's off the table. And both of those things seem true in the Sioux case too, right? If not because someone might say, well, but the asshole's free will is relevant, right? Is it? I mean, that's the thing that most people will feel is the preservation of that guy's free will worth this? That doesn't. Similarly with the soul making, either no souls are made in the Sioux case, or if they are, it feels like it's just not, there's no way it's worth it, right? So Rowe's strategy here is to pick these cases that have a real life oomph to them, and then try to come up with some reason that God could have for permitting those. And he himself comes up empty, and he thinks you're going to come up empty, right? You're not going to find anything that looks like a morally justifying reason for that conclusion. And then now here's the big point. The big point is an inductive inference from that. So he gives us those horrors, and then he says, try to think of a good reason that God could have. You come up empty, and then he thinks from that you should infer probably there is no reason that would justify God in that. And now that's the justification for the first premise of his argument, that there really are gratuitous evils. Why I think there are gratuitous evils? Well, because we can see that there are cases where we can't come up with any explanation for what could be God's good reason. So probably there is no good reason. So that's how he secures one. And now notice that's secured inductively. That's secured by this inductive inference from we can't think of any good reason for God to permit those horrors, to probably there is no good reason. That is, probably they're gratuitous. And that's the support for one. And that's why the conclusion of the argument is probably there's no God, because Rowe is recognizing that his grounds for that first premise are inductive. They're probabilistic, right? How's that?
So, no, that's good. I was just responding to someone in the chat who was talking about a potential way they were thinking of resolving it. But so Rowe himself says what he's doing with this argument then is he's kind of providing that he's trying to say that there might be considerations from evil which compel people towards atheism. So he's not making this kind of knockdown case, and in doing so, he also talks about how theists might plausibly respond to this.
Yeah,
I thought it might be useful to talk about some of Rowe's kind of suggestions that he puts out there for how theists might kind of evaluate this set of premises that he's put together.
Yeah, nice. I mean, one thing to say about that is one of the reasons that I love William Rowe, right, is because maybe he sets a model for us, Nathan, for you and I, and for lots of other people, right? Remember that paper was called, the subtitle of it was Some Varieties of Atheism. And the some varieties turn out to be special, friendly and unfriendly atheism. And that distinction, I think, is a really useful one, right? So he thinks of himself as a friendly atheist. What's the distinction? Well, the unfriendly atheist is someone who thinks every theist is an idiot douche, right? That is, there's no way to be a theist and be intelligent or morally decent. You must be either, you must be either morally bad or stupid to be a theist. And but a friendly atheist is one who thinks, well, no, you could be I'm not Rowe. Rowe is an atheist. I'm a friendly atheist. I'm not a theist. I don't think the arguments go through. But I don't think that all my friends who are theists are idiot douches. I think they have intelligent things to say to this, and I don't think their theism is completely irrational, etc. So I'm a friendly theist in that regard, or a friendly atheist in that regard. And parenthesis, or by parallel reasoning, I hope I myself am a friendly theist. That is, I don't encounter atheism as a thing that you could endorse only by being an idiot douche. You could be very intelligent and be an atheist. You could be a deeply morally committed person and be an atheist. The things we're talking about here aren't about that, it seems to me. They are always sort of on a nub where being intelligent and morally serious can pull right at a seam that puts us on separate sides of that seam, but without either of us being idiot douches, as it were. Right? So it's in this. The reason I want to bring that out is because the way that Rowe then he brings up this deep problem, and then he says, here are some responses to it that I think, and he even thinks they have merit, right? And maybe I'll just jump to the, I mean, one that at least I feel some actual sympathy with, right? The way that Rowe originally more or less suggested that theists should be thinking about his problem was by way of what he called the Moorean shift, right? So how far into that should I go, Nathan? I mean,
maybe just to briefly
background, do you think, or do you just?
Yep. I don't think we have to, because I think that in itself is like, as you say, that's like an interesting topic about, when is this a legitimate move? When does it kind of add ad hoc bloat to a theory to respond in this way? Or so, and there's so much that can be said, but maybe to yeah, maybe if you just briefly say like what it is for someone to respond that way and how it applies in this context.
Could I ask you by any chance, how hard would it be to put the argument back up?
Oh yeah, easy. Just one click. There you go.
Perfect. Okay, so here was what Rowe thought that the theist could quite reasonably do, and he calls it the Morean shift because it's connected to this this early 20th century thinker G.E. Moore, some of the things that he said about skepticism more generally. But here was the idea. He thought, look, Rowe himself thinks this argument in front of you is a good argument. Okay, but he also noticed that suppose you wanted to keep the second premise, right? You agree with the second premise. Everybody, imagine me, qua theist. Suppose I think 2 is right. There's a question about whether or not I think 2 is right, but just set that aside for now. So I suppose I keep this claim. Well, if God exists, there'd be no gratuitous evils. But I think for independent reasons, reasons totally independent from the problem of evil, I think I have some really kick-ass arguments or reasons to think God exists independently of this problem. That is, I have really good reasons for thinking, independent reasons for thinking 3 is false. That is, I think God exists independently. And now I accept 2, right? If God exists, there are no gratuitous evils. Well, now the conclusion of that will be, well, there really aren't any instances of gratuitous evils, or there probably aren't any of them. And what Rowe noticed is that creates there is a kind of epistemic dilemma that the theist can take advantage of here. And he himself just says, look, they can do that. That is, if you think you've got genuine, forceful, independent reasons for thinking that God exists, then given that you also accept with me that God's existence would entail, or something like entail, that there are no gratuitous evils, you're within your rights to conclude, so probably there are no gratuitous evils. So for any instance of a gratuitous evil that's presented to you, you'd be like, look, I've got reasons for thinking it's not gratuitous because I've got reasons for thinking God exists. And Rowe himself says, look, I think that's fine. What it turns on is, Rowe said, I evaluate the arguments or considerations in favor of God's existence differently than my theist friends, but I don't think they're crazy, right? And I think that's still got something going for it. That is, if you really do, you confront this argument and you confront it sincerely. You're not trying to run from it. This is one of the problems. All of these moves, there can be people just trying to run from it, but you're not trying to run from it. You really are seeing the force of the Sue and the Fawn cases. And the just massive, I just recently, Nathan, I'll just report, was just doing some recent reading and coming across the report of this disease. Maybe it was in a Hudson paper. This disease that maybe as many as 500,000 children have, where they're born in such a way that their sensitivity to pain is so high that just to be held or touched or loved is to cause them great, great pain. That one made me mad again, right? In reading that, I was mad at the universe again. And someone who feels the force of that and finds themselves thinking there's probably no God, I really don't think that they're being irrational. I see what they're feeling. Sincerely. At the same time, now there'll be lots of your viewers who can't feel this at all. The other side of this too, there are some of us who think we've had either experiences or recognition of certain kinds of arguments that have made the existence of God fairly strongly clear. And if you think that, if you're in that camp, then you'll run the Moorean view the other direction. And then the point is just this: the epistemic dilemma is which do you feel you have more confidence in? Which do you feel you have more confidence in the claim that there really are gratuitous evils that don't contribute to any greater good or to the avoidance of any worse evil, or more confidence that God exists? And all I want to see here, and Rowe was prepared to say, is he doesn't think that's just an obvious point. Like, he thinks that you can genuinely disagree about that. And if a theist with a certain set of experiences or knowledge of certain kinds of arguments or judgments about those arguments thinks I've got more confidence than God exists, then that there are gratuitous evils, that person's not making a mistake if they resist my argument, Rowe thought.
So the next point I wanted to talk about, which is one that you raise in your book, is about these kind of no-seum objections for reasons that God might have for permitting evils, and also skeptical theism. But I think that skeptical theism is sort of motivated maybe more by some of Paul Draper's stuff than it is by. But I don't know. Maybe you can speak to that. Than it is by Rowe's stuff. But so the first part of this question is like, what's the kind of the idea behind a no-seum objection?
Yeah, good. So I think this is a sort of a neat, if things can be neat when we're talking about, remember, I think we talked about this last time, right? I've been talking about the problem of evil enough that I can sometimes get a little cavalier about these things, especially when we're into the nuts and bolts of the reasoning. And then, I just want to remind myself of children who are in great pain merely because they were born with this disease, and how to go on with what's neat about a certain kind of argument in the face of that reality is not always easy. Okay. But we try. Okay. Give the suffering its real due, but then try to do what we can philosophically. Here's the part that's sort of philosophically neat about the way this goes, is that if you think about the way I described Rowe's argument, why he thinks the first premise of his argument is true, it was from this little inference, from we can't think of any good reason that God has for allowing the evils, to probably there is no good reason for God to allow those evils, right? That's the inference. And Stephen Dykstra has sort of, in a nice way, called this little inference the inference from we can't think of what the reasons are to probably there are no good reasons. He's called that little move a no-seum inference, okay? That is, from the fact that you don't see something, you reasonably conclude that that thing doesn't exist, right? And here it's worth seeing, right, that no-seum inferences are often perfectly good inferences, right? There's lots of cases in which the thing to do is conclude from the fact that you don't see something that it's not there, right? I mean, if Nathan looks, somebody comes in and says, "Hey, Nate, is the horse in your office there?" And he looks around and doesn't see a horse, and he reports, "Nope, no horse in here." That's a perfectly good no-seum inference, right? From the fact that he doesn't see a horse in his room to there's probably no horse in his room. And notice we still have to say probably, right? I mean, there's dumb things like, I don't know, maybe it's a really tiny horse or what have you. But that's a good inference. From the fact that I don't see any beer in the fridge to there are no beer in the fridge, also perfectly good no-seum inference. Okay. But what Dykstra pointed out very early on in this discussion was that, there are bad no-seum inferences too, right? And it's a bad no-seum inference if I look up at the night sky and I don't see any space aliens, and I conclude, well, I don't see any space aliens, so there are probably no space aliens there, right? Or if I look across a big cornfield and I say, well, I don't see any ladybugs, so there are probably no ladybugs in there. Bad no-seum inference. And then what Dykstra tried to get people to see was to reflect on, well, what would make for a good no-seum inference or a bad no-seum inference, right? And here's the way he put it, and other people have tried to precify this more and more, but the basic idea was this: a no-seum inference is a good one when we've got what it takes, such that if the thing were there, we'd probably perceive it, right? So that's what's going on in the horse case, right? I mean, the reason we think it's a good no-seum inference if Nathan says there's no horse in here is because we think Nathan has what it takes, such that if there were a horse in there, you'd probably see it, right? Similar with me and the beer in the fridge. If there were a beer in the fridge, I'd probably see it, right? But in the bad cases, in the cases of the space aliens in the night sky or the ladybugs, we think, well, Dan doesn't have what it takes, such that if you looked up in the night sky, he'd probably see the aliens if they were there. They might be so far off and out of my reach. And the same with the ladybugs. They could be there, and I just might look. My eyes are going bad, and it's big territory, and I can't see it all. So we don't. Okay, but now once you've got that thought, that what makes for a good no-seeum inference is the idea that we have what it takes, such that if the thing were there, we'd probably recognize it or perceive it or appreciate it or something like that. Then you can see how the theist is going to use this thought, and this is the thought that's now sometimes called skeptical theism. Put tersely, I think of the skeptical theistic move is basically the idea that we should be, that the theist is within her rights in withholding judgment, that we have what it takes, such that if there really were good reasons for God allowing something as horrible as the fawn or the suitcase, we'd probably recognize them. So I take the skeptical theist position to be just something like, with respect to the kinds of evils that Rowe and others are pointing us to, our attitude towards them should be like our attitude towards the ladybugs in the cornfield, and not like our attitude towards the horse in Nathan's office. That is, we should think it's not that plausible that I have what it takes, such that if there were a good reason for God to permit one of those E1 or E2 type of things, I'd probably be able to recognize and appreciate them. And so the skeptical theist is just making that point. And then now notice, that's not to all of that. What all of that machinery I just described would be doing is just saying, Rowe tells us we should accept that there are gratuitous evils. That's the first crucial premise of his argument. And then the skeptical theist just says, look, I don't think you've made a good case for that, because your case for that turns on a form of inference that it looks reasonable for me to just shrug my shoulders and be like, I don't think I accept the inference, so I'm within my rights in not accepting that premise. The premise may still be true, but I think I'm within my rights in not accepting it.
So a first kind of question about this that I've got is, do you think that this is in tension with a kind of credulity principle, or like phenomenal conservatism or something? So,
Good.
you know, like when you were saying about reading about some of these evils, like these diseases and things, it just really kind of seems to you that, you know, there's maybe like no good reason why, and
Nice.
you know, there's a lot that could be said about that seeming or whatever, but I'm wondering if someone who takes this kind of response, it's going to be in conflict with a phenomenal conservatism that they might want to appeal to in other kind of areas of their thought.
Nice. Very nice. And that part of the reason that's nice is because I myself feel some attractions to phenomenal conservatism, to the idea that there's that, you know, put neatly or something, that our epistemology probably has to get started with the seemings somehow, right? It better be that the seemings have something going for them in themselves. Otherwise, it's hard to see how we get any of our epistemic machinery up and running. So I'm attracted to that. And furthermore, and of course, Nathan, you know this, so I'm not telling you something you don't know, but maybe your viewers don't. That's a really nice, Swinburne basically makes this point too, right? So Swinburne is someone who, he's not very sympathetic to this skeptical move, in part because he's deeply committed to that principle. He loves that principle of credulity. You might think that's a mark of the Swinburnian project, is that principle of credulity. And he thinks, this will be to your point, Nathan. He thinks that there are some evils, and maybe he thinks it's like the fawn or the suitcase, where it will seem to us that this thing is incompatible with the existence of a loving God. It will seem to us that not even an omnipotent, omnibenevolent being could have a reason for permitting this. And point taken. There's some subtleties here about the seeming you hinted at. My impulse is, if someone reports that to me about the cases, I don't have a lot of I don't think I have a lot of leverage to resist them. the only point I guess I would make on this is I sometimes worry about the phenomenal conservatism moves when the seemings, how to put it, you know, it's one thing for me for it to seem like I have a cup in my hand, and then for that to be the ground for my claim to know I have a cup in my hand. I seem to have a cup in my hand, and I don't have any defeaters, so probably I really do have a cup in my hand. That seems okay. When the seeming gets complex, like suppose someone said, I think I say this in the book, but now you have to remind me if I had, when if someone says, it seems to me that the cups being here in this way is inconsistent with Berkeleyan idealism or some other metaphysical view, right? It's inconsistent with Platonism. That's the way it seems to me. Then I think, well, I'm not sure that seeming is also is probative in the same way, and it's partly because I have a temptation to think either, well, that's not how seemings work, or you're mistaking a seeming for an inference. You've got an inference running in there, right?
I refute it thus.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it, right? That kind of thing seems like, well, it's however it is that the original epistemic oomph is coming from our seemings. To me, when someone reports that they have a seeming as noted this, so in my other philosophical life, I work on the problem of free will, and some people, Swinburne is one of them, reports. Some people report. So I'm a libertarian about free will. I think that I defend the view. When I say I'm a libertarian, do I believe we have free will? I defend the libertarian view about free will. And Swinburne also does, and he defends the view, and others do too, by saying that he thinks it seems to us that we have libertarian free will. I'm like, what? I mean,
yeah,
I think it.
I sent him an email about this actually, where I was saying, so like, can you just help me, because I just don't understand like how this is supposed to work. Like I want to kind of step back and think of this like a model. And he's like, well, you just do wiggle your finger, and I'm like, no, that's the thing I'm trying to have an account of. You can't just like appeal to it.
Exactly. Okay, I'm totally with you, right? So if someone says, I guess I do think I report this seeming. I think it, and there are some. I think there's some social psychological literature to support this seeming, but I think it does seem to me on some occasions like I could have done something other than what I did. That seems to me to be the case. But to get to that, from that to and determinism is false, like that's a thesis about the physical structure of the laws of nature, and either I think I don't have that seeming, or even if I do, I would be inclined to be suspicious that seeming could have the same sort of epistemic authority as the one that it seems to me that there's a mug here. Getting that all right is hard. Okay, so I don't want to go too far afield, but remember that the reason I was raising it is because when somebody reports that it seems to them that a certain kind of evil, and make it really horrible, it seems to them that that's not a thing that a perfectly loving God could permit for any reason. I just find myself in a very similar kind of state as I do with the person who thinks that their seeming is inconsistent with Berkeleyan idealism. Well, it's that is the seeming now stretches not just from features that are intrinsic to this thing, but to its interconnectedness to a web of other axiological things. Like I just feel like either I don't have a seeming that connects up to that whole thing, or if I do, I start to lose my grip on why it should have this initial epistemic oomph that I think I do get for this. So I don't know. Is that too long a convoluted way of saying?
Just it's nuanced, right?
Yeah,
there's a lot more that can be said about that.
That's
There's
right.
not going to be like a knockdown.
Because remember, like so on the one hand, I do want to still maintain something like the phenomenal conservative. There's something like the principle of credulity that I'm inclined to accept, but it seems to me that it's doing too much work if it gets us to epistemic support for theses that are pretty complexly integrated into the rest of reality and not just connected up to my immediate perceptions or the way things seem to me cognitively, right? Because I do think the fact that it seems to me that two things are equal to a third thing or equal to each other is a reason for accepting that. But if I say it seems to me that Fermat's last theorem is true, I don't know. There's more complexity to that. Maybe my seeming there should be taken with a grain of salt, right?
Right. Another question about this kind of line of reasoning was, wouldn't we expect to see the reasons? I was thinking, perhaps the atheologian is kind of going about their secular project of just considering, well, if I consider what I think might be a live option about theism and what kind of properties that this being might have, well, presumably they have the power to kind of interact in the world in various ways, and they're good, and they want what's best for us and so forth. So wouldn't they kind of help us to understand those reasons somehow, if they did exist, or to know that they're there, in order that we wouldn't think our suffering was futile or something like this? And now, obviously, there's going to be a disagreement somewhere there, but I wondered what your thoughts would be in response to something like that.
Yeah, good. I mean, I think this goes pretty deep, right? That last time we were talking, Nathan, we started out by noting, you were asking about what are the principles of success and agreed upon aspects of the framework from which we could have fruitful discussions about these things, and we were noting it's complex and hard, and one of the points I was making, and you seem sympathetic to, was this broad sense in which there's a holism about these things that we're aiming at. Even as we jump in and start thinking about Rowe's argument, as if Rowe's argument is independent of a bunch of other metaphysical and religious and epistemic commitments, which we're all unpacking as we go along. This is not to say we don't try to figure out an argument, but just note that when you go to evaluate it, it's not long before everything is involved, right?
Right.
And here, part of what seems to me to be the decision point, or the one of the nubs, is if you do think that if God exists and is anything like the God that's hinted at in the world's classical theisms or something like that, that suggests that we would have good reason to trust our no-seem inferences about God. That is, here's another way of putting it: is someone might say, am I understanding the complaint well enough this way, Nathan, that you're imagining someone who says, well, look, if you're a theist, then you should think you would have what it takes, such that when you were presented with these cases, you'd be in a pretty good position to make good judgments about those things.
Yeah, it's something. The thought is something like, the person saying, well, we should kind of have this. There's this extra layer to the no-seem inference, which has to be that, if the thing that we don't see were there, we would expect to see it. And then it's to say, well, when I reflect on theism, the objector is to say, well, when I reflect on theism and what a good God can and would do, kind of as opposed similarly to almost the evidential argument, he can do it and he would do it, is sort of make these reasons quite salient and available to people, so as they can kind of understand the suffering that they face in a particular kind of way or something.
Yeah, what to say about that? I mean, maybe what I could say about it is it comes from, picks up from a point that Hick was good on, right? So when Hick was developing his soul-making theodicy, he took notice that when he worked out all of the possible ways that, and importantly worked out the connection among the possible ways that soul making could need evil, could need genuine obstacles, he does get to a point where he says, hey, there's a thing that's left out of my story, and they're what he ends up calling dysteleological evils, right? That is, it looks like there are evils where they don't look like they contribute to soul making. They look like they are either just destructive of human psychology or an absolute. They're just a blight on moral development. And he notes, I got a problem there, right? How am I going to explain that? And what he ends up going for, and here I think there was wisdom in this, and it's related to the way we're thinking about the question now. At the heart of that theodicy, I think, is the thought that God may be aiming for a certain kind of moral development among creatures. And I think that moral development is much more complex than we typically think. Oftentimes we just think singularly about, oh, soul making just means God's trying to make me into a better person. But I think if anything is plausible in this soul making story, it's much more complex and integrated than that God would have an interest, not just in my becoming morally good, that is godlike, but also Nathan becoming morally good, and all of us, and then all of our cooperative efforts to integrate something into a genuinely, like, the picture here is that there's a genuinely great, maybe incomparably great good to free creatures by way of their freedom coming to moral development in such a way that we genuinely cooperate together in sort of trans global concern. And that's an extremely high value, really, really important thing. So I think something like that is behind Hick's thought. And then the way he puts it is about the dysteleological evils is, in order, the initial announcement goes something like this: in order for us to genuinely develop in these ways, God can't be too close to us. And the reason God can't be too close to us is because if God's too close to us, then our efforts at this kind of development won't be genuinely free. They'll have a sort of coercive aspect by God's presence. But of course, given theism, God's distance from us can't be metaphysical. I mean, on the standard theistic stories, there's no way. God's nearness to me metaphysically is just built into the idea that he's sustaining the very particles that compose me and surrounds me in every way that I am surrounding every aspect of my own bodily content, right? So God is as close to me metaphysically as could possibly be, and there's no way to metaphysically avoid that. So the only way, Hick thought, that God could get the relevant kind of distance from us in order for there to be genuine, uncoerced moral development would have to be epistemic. So God would have to be at an epistemic distance from us. And what's that mean? Well, that would mean that there must be some ways in which the universe is genuinely mixed and such that it's reasonable for people to be in doubt and to not have God's existence be completely obvious to them. And so now, with that thought in mind, and you go to the "wouldn't we expect them" rebuttal, as you're describing it nicely. Once I have all of that in mind, I find myself thinking, would I expect it? Well, no. I mean, there's a way in which the epistemic ambiguities will seem to me to be, if not expected, at least not that surprising, given the aims of a certain kind of development of free creatures into a certain kind of maturity that they'll have to do without the transparent presence of God. Okay, well then maybe the expectation that we would be able to know and appreciate these things, especially given the fact that we're in progress, we're developmental creatures. I find that maybe less plausible.
I think it's an interesting direction to go in, and there's probably endlessly more that could be said by both sides about these things.
Prince, can I just say it's precisely that's the thing that strikes me as that's part of the datum that's like that we're trying to wrestle with, is that right. I think what you just said is right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, because when I think about what you're saying, there's like a few avenues that my mind wants to go in. Like I think, well, when I think about what would be good for, I try to think by analogy what would be good for like me to teach a child or something. I'm like,
Yes.
well, if I give them really good reasons to like think about maths in the same way I think about maths or something, then I don't feel like I'm violating their free will or something
That's
like
right.
that. But then it seems maybe that's not quite what's being said. What's being said is that it there has to be this distance in order for people to kind of value the good, for it to come to develop the kind of character where they value the good for its own sake. But then that raises questions for me about, well, then, like, what is the purpose of like special revelation supposed to be in like Christian theism or Islamic theism or any of these kind of revealed theologies? Or is it the case that then actually you kind of build into your theology that the evidence, like the textual evidence, is quite bad, which maintains that epistemic distance? But there's kind of like an irony to, I don't know if you want to answer any of those things. Feel free to say something if you think there's.
Well, I don't think I have answers per se, but I.
Well, yeah, to add another layer. Yeah,
I take the point. I think it's a really good one. In the parent illustration here, right, is it cuts both ways, as we both know, and of course some of the things I've just said about the epistemic distance is directly connected to the problem of divine hiddenness, and so it's inhaling distance, right? We can hear it we hear it calling from here, and this will be related, but when I do think about uh, my my parenting, right? It does feel like a dicey matter to certainly when I was parenting. My son's now an adult, and so now I'm a grandparent. So I'm thinking about it all over again from the standpoint of being a grandparent. But I do remember feeling with parenting the deep tension between, on the one hand, um, giving him tools to come to understand the world independently of my judgments about the world, and also seeing that it didn't make a lot of sense that he could do that from scratch. That there were some respects in which he needed some grounding in a worldview that he could eventually reject. Right, that I wanted to give him the tools to reject if the time came, but that it had to come out of something like a stable, overarching worldview that then he could scrutinize later, as long as this worldview that I was helping him to develop had self scrutiny as part of its structure. In From that point of view, I think it makes sense that the way that God could try to raise human beings to the kind of ideal that I was describing, that still strikes me as that ideal, is, look, I got to give them enough to go on, and I got to make it so that certain kinds of seeking will involve finding, but it is going to have I am going to have to stay at a certain kind of distance from them in order for that moral development to be sincere and real and free and cooperative. And so it looks to me like a really, really delicate balance, but that something like special revelation could have a role to play in that. Notice, like you and I'm not a fundamentalist, right? So I don't think that the special revelation has a kind of unquestionable, buck-stopping epistemic authority, such that once you've got that in place, there's no doubting or something like that. Like, there's plenty of places to accept that there's such a thing as special revelation, and yet still be in grave doubt about whether, is this the thing that's being revealed, or should I understand it that way? And yet, nevertheless, there's a framework that makes for the possibility of a kind of coherent development that you can scrutinize and reject, but that's nevertheless in the background. So I'm inclined to think that it's something about that kind of, or at least something like that dialectic goes some distance towards handling the fact that the phenomenon's mixed.
So another question then, which is just along the lines of skeptical theism, which is, I think there's a concern people often raise, which is that if we suppose that, it could be the case, at least for any instance of evil, or maybe for every instance of evil, that there are good reasons that we just can't see for permitting it to happen, that this kind of undermines our capacity for moral reasoning. So suppose, like that, there's some crime that I could prevent or something that I come across, or what's the example that Peter Singer gives that's supposed to be so intuitive about someone drowning or whatever, and you walk past them and it's like, well, you just help them.
Just help them.
But supposing, there might be these reasons that you aren't aware of that exist, and you're kind of genuinely committed to that, then shouldn't that undermine this other kind of impetus to kind of to take away that evil situation, because you might actually be interfering with those unknown reasons. And so the idea is then that if one's a skeptical theist, then they sort of don't have any reasons to act in good ways in the world, and that's a problem then, like a reductio for the viewers.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and it's two things. One, something in the neighborhood of this. My skeptical theism has its bounds. Okay, so I'm not I think that there is a sort of intuitive and important sense in which the skeptical theistic move is reasonable and powerful. But I'm not all in on the skeptical theism. To me, it has its limits. Okay, and maybe it'd be worth talking about those. So that's one thing to note right away. But then I'll say this: that these worries about broadly, you might say one big worry about skeptical theism is that we can't keep the skepticism in its place, right? It's just supposed to be skepticism here, but then lots of critics keep saying, well, look, it expands to these other things. And the moral domain is one in particular, right? Where, moral stultification looks like a real problem. If it turns out that in virtue of endorsing skepticism about Rowe's inference, it entails I ought to be skeptical about whether or not to save the drowning child or, help my grandchild as opposed to something else. That looks like a really high cost. So I want to recognize that the conclusion would be bad. I find it like, sometimes I worry I'm not tracking the way that the deepest versions of this are supposed to be going, because I generally find it so wholly unmoving. And let me see if I can say why, and then maybe you can talk me out of it. One way of putting it is that lots and lots of my moral action is under ignorance all the time, right? I mean, what it is I have to do as a moral creature, I take it, is act on the best reasons that are available to me. And I know for any moral action I perform, right, that I could be oblivious to some moral facts that are relevant to the case. And that's true of the drowning child, right? I mean, I could, for all I know, independently of God, ignore God, right? I mean, for all I know, don't go over. If you got consequentialist concerns, which I do have, then this case won't persuade you, but you'll see that we could make the case the other way. For all I know, when I go to save the drowning child, there's some, douche who's planning to blow up half the world if I save the child. And so now I don't have a reason to, I don't know about that. All I can do is operate on the reasons that are given to me. And here they are, and they're present. And I don't think anybody can complain about I don't feel morally stultified by the recognition that that could be so. And so similarly, the fact that God might have reasons for letting the child drown that I don't have seems like, in some sense, neither here nor there with respect to if God said something to me, right? Like, don't save the drowning. Okay, well, now maybe I've got a reason, but barring that, and then just, another big point. This is when Swinburne's often on about, and it strikes me as an important one, independently, is the fact that God has a legitimate claim to do something just does not entail that I have one, right? A story I tell in the book is about, when I was about 2 or 3, I got up in the morning early on a Saturday or something, and my parents, they were smokers at the time. They had left some cigarette butts in an ashtray, and I thought it was cool. I picked up one of these and was pretending to smoke it. My dad came out and he saw me and he was like, "Oh, you want to light that up?" Sure. So he just lit me up. And I took my first puff and was like ruined, right? I mean, I was absolutely ruined. I was like just hacking up along. I have since never had any interest in smoking, none at all. Okay. Now, look, you might judge one way or the other whether or not you think my dad did a good parenting job there, right? You whatever you think, but notice, like, his doing that seemed like a legitimate parenting thing, even if you think, I wouldn't have done it, right? If he'd have done that to the kid at the park, right? Kid at the park walks up and like, oh, let me light you up, and he's just in the wrong position. He doesn't bear the relationship to that kid to be able to do such a thing. And I think that distinction, even though you might say there are reasons to try to help that kid not smoke, he's not in the right. And when I think of things like that, I think, look, there are going to be lots of cases where God may very well have a prerogative and have reasons for doing this. They just don't apply to me, right? And the fact that God has those reasons is neither here nor there with respect to the reasons that present themselves to me in these ways. And so I just haven't felt the force of the idea that in taking a very, what I think of as just a kind of epistemic humility about what God's reasons might be for allowing evils, that I'm thereby involved in a kind of stultification of my moral life more broadly.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So it's sort of like implicit in the criticism here is this kind of assumption, either that something like if God has a reason for acting a certain way, then that's also like a reason for me to act that same way. But in fact, we're different people with either different powers or different roles in the world and so forth, and that means that we just have different reasons to do so.
Right.
So my moral reasons are going to be different from God's moral reasons,
Right.
and so I act on behalf of my moral reasons, but God having different moral reasons doesn't necessarily to do things. It aren't reasons that don't provide me with reason to
That's right.
act.
That's the thought. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so then the last question then, so we've talked about kind of logical problems from evil, we've talked about evidential arguments from evil, and obviously there's a cottage industry of like different arguments from evil and so forth, but I thought what we could do to kind of conclude things is just think about, well, what does all this have to say about the rationality of theism and atheism? So we kind of talked about Rowe's idea of friendly atheism, and you talked about being a friendly theist as well. But I mean, what does this say either way? It doesn't seem like any of the arguments are kind of knocked down for either side. The considerations are knocked down for either side. The responses probably aren't going to shift atheists to become theists, but the arguments are also not shifting theists to become atheists. So what how should we think about these arguments then in light of that, and where does that kind of leave the state of the discourse?
Yeah, that's hard, but cool, because I do think, right.
I didn't mean to unplug my camera, by the way. I'm just going to fix that.
No, whatever.
I did it with my foot accidentally.
I see how it goes. Well, I suppose there is a place here where I find that sometimes that students can get a little annoyed by philosophy at about this point, because well, look, we didn't end up with some decisive conclusion. There really is a God, or all arguments against the existence of God on the basis of evidential evil considerations are stupid, or we didn't reach some kind of conclusion like that, and they can feel frustrated. Well, what are we getting at then? Can I just return to the idea that I do think there are more than one place in our conversation where, look, you can see my dispositions are they stay in the vein of, look, I think theism can be rational, right? Even in the face of these arguments, and even when I think I'm not trying to be evasive about the argument, I'm really trying to deal with the argument as presented. I think I can still be rational, and I also still think that the atheist can be rational. But I think if we did genuinely engage in this together, that we we illuminated some things, and maybe we moved closer together about some things. Like, like I said, the thing about this disease that these kids get, it- someone who says that's no evidence at all against the existence of God, I think, come on, right? That's some evidence, right? That is surprising. I think that is surprising on theism. Um, Given what I know about theism, that's surprising. Um, is it so surprising that it counteracts the other things that I think I know about the world that strike me as more surprising on naturalism than on the? It maybe doesn't counteract those, but it goes into the equation now, right? And 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 maybe there's something about the idea that we do better together in thinking about these things by seeing that there's a lot of things we can agree on, and then what we're trying to do is a very delicate balancing, as we said the last time. I think, Nathan, we're trying to compare worldview, like entire pictures of the world. And there's one, just to oversimplify, you've got a certain kind of naturalistic picture of the world. There's no God or anything like God's. And yet, and then, but of course, there's still a moral life, and there's et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's one picture. Here's another picture. Theism's true. The world's being overseen by a maximally good being who, for various reasons, has constraints that make it such that some evils either have to be, or it's good that they be in some regard, and but that they will ultimately be redeemed, right? And you got to compare those worlds. And look, I still favor the theistic story, but when I hear the very best arguments, I think I see something about the shape of this other one that helps me to reformulate mine. And just for what it's worth, I mean, I'm not closed off to becoming a naturalist, right? Um, it has still not seemed to me to be the best overarching story. And by best, I include all the truth considerations. So I don't want your readers being, oh, he's just going for, or your listener, he's just going for the thing that he likes best. No, I mean best in the whole overarching aesthetic, evaluative, truth conducive senses of that. It still seems to me that the theistic picture is best. But, but, but I think it's a close call. And I have no temptation to think that Paul Draper is being irrational, right? I have no temptation to think that William Rowe was being irrational, or that Nathan is being irrational. Um, and that's because it seems to me I'm with those very people. I feel like I'm still in a shared search for the truth about these things together. You're not dismissing me as an idiot. I'm not dismissing you as an idiot. I'm taking your data points seriously. You're taking mine seriously, and it's just a really hard thing, and it's a close call. Um, uh, and then there's this bigger question, which I kind of like, that got framed a little bit there at the end, Nathan, about whether or not, even what some people I think feel is that if theism were true, it's being a close call in this way wouldn't be the case. It would be clearer in some way that I really don't have that judgment anymore. Partly it's grounded in the thought about what I think it would be like, what if God exists, God would be seeking from human beings. And there, I think it's a kind of free cooperation, that it actually makes sense to me that things would have a certain kind of obscurity and mixed nature, and that we would have to be working it out and developing and growing up and becoming better, and becoming better cooperatively. And all of that does strike me as like, yep, a slightly mixed world would probably be the right way to go for that.
Yeah, I'm not actually a big fan of C.S. Lewis in his apologetic writings. Like, I really like Narnia, but
Sure.
one thing he has said that I like is he gives this sort of story about being in a shed where there's like some light coming through, and you can kind of you can see along the light where it looks like one thing, but you can also kind of like see through the light, and then you see this world outside. And I think what he's talking about by that is I think it's almost a kind of description of Gestalt psychology or something. And the idea is that you have to kind of inhabit one of whether or not you inhabit one of these structures kind of alters what you're going to consider something that has to be explained by a theory, because which of the perspectives you're standing in kind of orders your perception or what you're seeing in the world, and it might change what you consider to be an explanatory virtue or a theoretical virtue. At least I think, and that I think this is part of what makes it so hard to evaluate these theories holistically, because you can't just take off your stance and just like look at all the facts as it were as they are in and of themselves. You've got to evaluate them from some standpoint, and that standpoint comes with value judgments and value assumptions that are so difficult to get past. And I think there are prospects like you were saying, maybe after talking about all these things across different sides, you kind of have a deeper appreciation for different considerations, and you've shifted in some ways, but it is really difficult to figure out what should I really like convince someone either way, or how should we think about like moving forward overall in light of these considerations. I don't have an answer. I don't know what that would look like.
Nice. That's well put in sounds like we're probably coming to an end here. I can't tell, Nathan, is that right?
Yeah, that's about right. There's a few questions from the audience if you've got time, but don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, then I'll save the thing I was just going to say by way of conclusion after that. Yep.
Okay, sure. So Joe from Majesty of Reason says, much love to Dan. Question: what does Dan make of the moral skepticism objection to skeptical theism?
Good.
Which is what we just talked about.
Yeah, we're kind of on that, and maybe Joe would weigh back in chasing me a bit on this. In general, these expanding, skeptical explosion worries about skeptical theism have kind of not impressed me in general, because it tends to. What I think I find under them is there is some view about moral epistemology or epistemology simplicator that I don't find very plausible, in that's. I think we can still have responses to epistemic skepticism, even though even if I'm, because maybe this is the way to put it. Really, when I think about the skeptical theist impulse, I sincerely talk me down from this, Joe and Nathan or whoever. It really just seems to me to be a concern about a very reasonable form of epistemic humility. That is, what's behind it is just this thought, independently of the problem of evil, right? You just ask anyone, hey, if there is a God, like the traditions have said, right? So maximally all-powerful, good, etc. being. If there is such a being, how likely is it that you would be able to understand and appreciate that being's reasons for doing anything? And my view is not low, but my view is not high. It's just I just genuinely shrug at that. I just think I don't really know. Maybe there'll be lots of cases probably where that being might be very interested in me having reliable capacities to track the truth in domains. Sure. But there'll be lots of others where that being doesn't care or can't get me to those given my place in the development. And so I just shrug at that. But when I shrug there, does that mean I have to shrug about whether or not I've got moral reasons to pull the kid out of the pond, or whether or not I've got moral reasons to lie to the Nazis when they come to the door? I just don't quite see how my shrugging about that gets me to I don't have relevant forms of moral knowledge in the cases where I have to act.
So Max the Confessor asks, in the Fawn case, could you make an animal theodicy? I think a harder problem could be a natural evil, where it's not clear that the animal in question has any moral properties but can experience pain.
mean, I guess I think there can be some moral theodicies. You know, Swinburne tries the idea that to some degree that um, well, the animal, you know, how else are deer supposed to learn how to avoid forest fires but by a few getting caught in them? Um, in Maybe something like that's got a little bit of traction. Um, you know, at one place, Peter Van Inwagen says about things like that. I don't think it's about the fawn case, but about other things like, well, you know, how about really vivid dreams, right? You know, a really vivid dream. I imagine giving to deer really vivid dreams about how fires work, and that motivating them to avoid them. That might do. So maybe I need to hear the full on animal theodicy, but broadly, what I think that especially once you get not just from the fawn case in our context, but when you get to the problem of animal suffering, you know, that stretches back throughout biological history in the whole interlocking teleology of predation and evolution. Um, I think there's a real issue there about how to accommodate all of that suffering. Now, maybe Max has a satisfying view about that. I'd listen, right? But I find that challenging. But then the thought is go to things where there are no moral properties at all. I don't know what do you think he's imagining there, Nate? You think he's imagining like, you know, destruction of ecosystems, or it's not clear that the animal question where it's not clear.
Maybe, yeah, maybe he's trying to say
Natural evil, but where there's
maybe he's trying to, there's not any relevant moral facts that have
yeah
anything to do with the animal in according to Max. I'm not
yeah
really sure.
yeah. Well, I mean, it is worth seeing that. I do think that you know it's not as if suffering is the only morally relevant category, right? Or at least not the only normatively relevant category. And you know, there's problems of ugliness or um, uh, other forms of what I might think of. You might be able to talk me into evils that don't just bottom out in suffering. It has seemed to me that the reason that the problem of evil has typically turned on suffering is because that kind of evil is so salient to us. But there are other evils that seem to me not to issue in suffering, but would still be serious, could still count as serious evidence against the existence of God. Um, right? I mean, the problem of the fawn's suffering would be the problem of the Rose fawn's case wouldn't would be less bad if fawns, when caught in forest fires, you know, died, but it was pleasurable to them, right? When they burned, it was like a kind of mild tickling, and then right at their death, there was a kind of orgasmic sensation just as they died. That would make it better, right? But I don't think that the problem would, strictly speaking, go away. You'd still be like, well, there is a good to the life's continuing, and that was robbed in this way. So, you know,
I
that's
feel
just
if people start answering like that, you know, like that, it's not a far step from sort of saying, you know, like, well, you can't prove that the Heaven's Gate cult didn't get on the UFO when they, you
yes,
know, like,
right, exactly,
like,
yeah, that's right, yeah.
yeah.
Again,
I
if the
mean,
problem
all
was
you saw was the dead bodies, but you know, they
right,
got, you know, they
exactly, yeah,
went,
that's
yeah.
you can see that's a little point where if insofar as the problem was supposed to be a purely logical one, though we might raise those very things, right? That would be, but we're you know we're way past that. We want things that count as, that are going to be, you know, they have a certain kind of evidential force to them. So
So, and I can't read Arabic, so sorry, I don't know what your name is,
uh-oh.
but this person asks, why do we need skeptical theism if God's different moral if God's different moral position is enough to justify his allowing the evils in question.
Yeah, good. I mean, there's a version of theism, and maybe classical theism even, where the general problem of evil evaporates because
who are you, old man?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you know, if you really do think, like some, you know, Thomists are not far from this oftentimes, right? Look, God's not a moral, he's not a member of our moral community. God's not is not a moral, God owes no obligations to creatures. In what God does is what is good. So that's the definition of goodness, is just whatever God does. So if he did decide to torture babies, that would be good. And it's true, you know. So one way to be a coherent theist is to endorse that kind of view, and then you know, you can, there's no problem of evil, strictly speaking, from that point of view. Why have I not gone that way? I mean, there are all these problems about the relationship between analogy and univocity for God talk, but my own judgment is that if the notion of goodness that we are deploying isn't at least verisimilitudinously related to the notion of goodness that we're applying when we say that God's good, then, I mean, maybe one way to put it is, like, philosophy is just irrelevant, right? I mean, and so that this is exactly what our person might be thinking, is like, you know, forget philosophy. This is beyond philosophy. We should just be, you know, being obedient to the God who commands whatever God commands. I haven't. That strikes me as a morally dangerous view. It's not consistent with what I think of about the kind of goodness that I would expect God to have for creatures. If God is good, that God would be wanting creatures to, as we said, as you know, you can see that the Hickeyan thing is playing enough of a role in my own thinking about this, that God would be wanting us to become more and more like God, and that therefore our conceptions of goodness are at least bearing a important relationship to the notion of goodness that is properly applied to God. And, you know, if you get too far away from that, it stops looking like a God I could worship any longer. I might have to submit to this being, right? There's no, like, if it's just a badass God whose conceptions of goodness are totally arbitrary, I might have to obey, so that I don't get, you know, beat up. But the central notion of worship will seem to me to have been lost if it's not that it's at least closely enough or analogous to or an extension of our best concept of goodness. If that doesn't apply, then you know, I'm not going to genuinely worship you.
I think I read a response to that sort of a objection of you know, the arbitrariness. I think it was Alexander Proust who said something like, well, the problem with that is it kind of just follows trivially for kind of any meta-ethical theory or any ethical theory. So suppose, you know, it was if it was a universalizable maxim to you know, torture babies for fun, then it would be good to torture babies for fun. Or, you know, if it maximized utility to torture babies for fun, you know, if God commanded, if divine command theory is true and God command. So I think that's one way I've seen people deal with that. But I think there's maybe an additional, and this might go beyond the scope of philosophy and into broader theology, but I think there's an additional problem that gets raised then by interpretations of the Old Testament and passages about, you know, God commanding war and things like that. And the idea that that's wrong, you know, today.
Yeah, good. I mean, yeah, for philosophers and Christians of my ilk, you know, there's a lot of pressure coming from those Old Testament passages, for sure, and how to respond to those. And, you know, I think I have plausible things to say, but they'll sit uncomfortably with some parts of the tradition, for sure. Yeah.
So Lena asks, is a no-seeum inference more effective in situations where the existence of the phenomenon in question is in doubt to begin with?
That's good. I don't know. I was thinking, my initial thought was that is this thought, well, we know there's such thing as beer. So the question, whether there's beer in the fridge is one thing. We don't know
I
that
think so.
there's,
Yeah.
yeah, we don't know that there's
Yeah.
such thing as extraterrestrials. So
Right.
extraterrestrial
Yeah.
intelligent life or something.
Or,
So
or maybe like poltergeists or something. You know, like
yeah,
Swinburne gives examples with, or gremlins in the closet is one, and you can
yeah,
say
good.
there's these. Yeah, you can set up these kind of like likelihood ratios, as it were, between. But the
Yes.
problem is that the prior maybe isn't high enough to
Yeah, good.
that it changes the way we evaluate a no-seeum or something. I don't
Good,
know.
good, good. Yeah, that's a nice point. Right. Yeah. Um, good. See, like, look, the what starts out as a kind of intuitive idea about the distinction between no-seum, good and bad no-seum inferences. You see, with one good question, oh, well, the epistemology of that goes deep, right? And it turns out that
Yeah, yeah.
whether or not I ought to think the no-seum inference is good looks like it does already depend on some commitments I've already made epistemically about whether or not things like this could exist or were likely to exist. Yeah, I think that's a nice point. Yeah,
It seems to me like maybe this question of the no-seum inference is internal to kind of like assuming the phenomena anyway. So it's kind of like saying, you know, if we assume that this phenomena exists, then let's think about whether or not we'd have good reasons.
good.
Um, and so it's an internal question, and maybe so whether, and then the question of our credence towards the existence of the phenomena
Nice,
at all maybe is like a separate question. Is
good.
my thinking about that?
Nice.
But
That's good. That might be right. I mean, because remember the way that I'm thinking of the skeptical theist's response, um, it is internal to theism, right? I mean, I think that this when I put my point about uh, the epistemic humility that I think is behind the skeptical theism, I invoked it like, look, I think we should all have the shoulder shrugging attitude towards the question, if God exists, would we how likely is it we'd know what God's good reasons were for doing things? I think we should all, whether theist or not, probably shrug our shoulders at that. Um, but the actual deployment of the principle in the debate with respect to Rowe's argument is internal to theism, right? I mean, the theist is just trying to say um, it's purely defensive maneuver, right? Rowe tells us, I've got this argument that shows you should become an atheist. And the theist is just saying, hold on, holding fixed my theistic commitments and having that come at me, I think I have a way of saying why I don't find the first premise all that forceful. And that's enough to insulate me rationally in my and I still think something like that remains largely right. But you know, it's remember I also said I'm not taking my skeptical theism neat. That is, I do think that there are constraints on how far the skeptical theism could go. And if you asked, and I think Lena's question is pushing this too. If you asked, what's the principled at what principled point would you give up your skeptical theism? You know, if the shit show of the universe was bad enough, and what would be the principle? It's very hard for me to say. I can only go to extreme cases and say, well, in those cases, I would think that was pretty good evidence that God didn't exist. Our world's not like that, uh, but then when you ask for the explanation for, you know, where along the line, like I don't know for sure. Yeah.
yeah, I think I saw you say yesterday on Twitter something like if people were just kind of came into being into like a fiery pit or something like that for 10 minutes and then
Yeah.
they just like disappeared, then that
Yeah.
would be that's definitely in the too far camps.
I think so. I would not be very tempted to invoke skeptical theism in that case. That's right. But I don't know exactly how to. I feel like there's a principled ground there, but I haven't worked it
Yeah.
out. And I feel like we're like, you know, for your viewers who are, hey, how does philosophy get done by mediocre philosophers? Just like that. We're like, I think I see the nub of a thing I want to say. Because there are lots of people, skeptical theists, especially in the interwebs, who are just like, I'm a skeptical theist. And so I think there's no evil is evidence against God. I don't have that view, right? I think that something's right about the skeptical theism, and yet I do think evil often is evidence, not overwhelming, but it could be. When would that be? I want to think more about that, but I don't have it worked out.
So just a couple more questions.
Sure.
So Jamie, thank you for the super chat, but I thought it was, so the cost of the super chat I think expands with the character limit. So I think this one's been shortened a bit to keep under the $2 limit. So it's still appreciative of the super chat.
Sending you money actually costs them words. I see. That seems like a bad model, man.
So it says more influence on your theism, Bible or philosophy?
Yeah. I don't think I could pull them apart any longer. The Bible is a pretty deep influence. That's that's where the I don't know how to describe it, where I take my intellect and soul to get its sort of most fundamental feeding. But I also think maybe this is just a Thomistic picture, right? That that the intellect is not inconsistent. The things that we can discover by the intellect are not going to be inconsistent with the things that God wants to reveal to us. So now notice, that doesn't mean that there aren't potential conflicts. That happens all the time. My own devotional reading frequently ends with me saying to my wife sitting, across from me in the room, like, what's the right way to think about this weird passage in light of moral commitments that seem to me to be very clear that look to be in conflict with this? Then you try to work those things out. But I have a kind of hopefully well-earned confidence that there are ways for those things to be worked out, and there's insights that I think I get from various forms of revelation that I don't get from philosophy, but also the same is true from the other direction. So I don't know. I think they're dynamically related.
And so last question then, John V or John V asks, can God be pleased with some things of the world? If so, could he be pleased with suffering?
Well, certainly to the first question, could God be pleased with things of the world? I think the answer to that is yes. I think that the biblical creation picture, God made everything. It said that it was good, and things like, quite pleased with these things. When they're, I think God looks at the Crab Nebula and thinks that's good. God looks at Yosemite Valley and thinks that's good. I think God looks at honest conversation between Nathan and I and thinks that's good. So could he be pleased with suffering? Lots of suffering is perfectly fine to be pleased with, right? I mean, I watched my son, wrestle through teenagedom in some pretty crappy ways and come out on the other side a pretty decent human being. And I think, hey, the things he had to suffer to get to that, I'm good with that. What I think God can't be pleased with is kinds of suffering that if we had all done better, we wouldn't have had, right? Those are the kinds of things God doesn't want those. Like if we would all, we didn't have to have the Holocaust, right? We didn't have to have the killing fields. There were ways to avoid having buildings collapse on people. There were people being more responsible. So those forms of suffering, it seems to me, God couldn't be pleased with. That he would lament those. Would be lamenting those just as deeply as we would be.
Okay. So that is it for questions. Do you remember what the final point was that you wanted to make before, or is it gone? Don't worry.
That's a good question. I think it was this. We were kind of on the nub of the idea that there's a kind of a close call between the total theistic story and the total atheistic story, especially when you're factoring in all the, and maybe I'll just announce this stuff I'm working on presently. Nathan, you might want to even think about it more with me at some point, is that, my own impulses are shifting. A lot of what contemporary philosophy of religion and especially apologetics has taken itself to be aiming at is epistemically justified belief. You know, oh, we got to get beliefs to get justified. I'm decreasingly intrigued by the importance of belief, especially in the way that philosophers think about it, and I'm much more interested in properties like mental states like hoping, and so we might be genuinely torn about whether or not we should believe these things because things like teeter on a knife edge epistemically. And maybe we get more fruitful progress by turning our attention to the question, but should we hope that theism's true? Or would and if could that give us some extra leverage? And I myself am tempted to think we'd be better off. We should hope that theism is true rather than hope it's not true. And I've got reasons for thinking that, and some of them will probably have already jumped immediately to mind for you. But if you did think it was genuinely kind of the question of belief is genuinely balanced by near proximity, then you might think, well, questions about hope or faith might come in and be a difference maker there, and I'm tempted by that.
Next week I'm interviewing a philosopher called John Cottingham, who's he's written quite a lot about Descartes, but he's a Christian philosopher as well, and he's written a few things on the role that the emotions should play in our kind of reasoning, particularly about religious matters. So that might come close as well to some of the things that you're talking about, you know,
Love it.
not maybe not as specific as like what should we hope for, but I guess he wants to talk about, well, how should people think about like emotional responses in light of religion, or maybe even like aesthetic considerations, or how like a church service makes them feel or something. Should that be a consideration? And
Nice.
I think he's got some interesting things to say. So
nice. Those do sound related to me. Yeah. Given what I think about the nature of hope. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, maybe we could talk about that at some point in future, maybe, you know, 6 months to a year or something. If you've got a book or a paper that you're working on, I could give it a read and we could talk about it. But thank you for coming on and giving up so much of your time as well to talk to me, and also doing public philosophy more generally, because not just on my channel that you've been on a few others to do these things. Is there anything you want to promote to people while you're kind of here? It's all right if not. Just as an opportunity to direct them. No, okay.
No, I feel like maybe I should have something to say to that, but I don't.
So. Yeah, just to your. I mean, I'll put your Twitter handle in the description, right? And people can go and follow you on Twitter and harangue you about things and make your life slightly worse by arguing with you on the internet.
Yeah, right. I'm trying to learn how to ignore that if I can, but
yeah. Well, thank you everyone for watching. Yeah, I'm the conversation there. Leave a like, share it around, let me know what you thought in the comments as well. And you can support me on Patreon if you have the inclination to do so financially as well. So the link for that is in the description. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.